For decades, holding US dollars as reserves was not controversial. It wasn't ideological. It wasn't political. It was simply practical. Dollars worked because the system around them worked. US Treasuries worked because nothing else matched their liquidity, scale, and reliability. And most importantly, no one seriously worried that access to them could be revoked for reasons unrelated to finance. That assumption mattered more than people realize. Because reserves are not supposed to be productive assets. They are supposed to be there when everything else stops working. And then, slowly, that assumption weakened. Sanctions expanded. Financial infrastructure became a foreign policy tool. Access to settlement systems became conditional. Still, most countries told themselves this was exceptional. Temporary. Targeted. Until it wasn't. The freezing of Russia's foreign exchange reserves wasn't shocking because of Russia. It was shocking because of precedent. It revealed something that could not be unseen. Reserves could be neutral in name, but political in reality. At that moment, every central bank that was not perfectly aligned with Washington had to absorb a new, uncomfortable truth. Reserves you do not control are not reserves. They are permissions. That doesn't make the dollar bad. It makes it conditional. And once that realization settles in, the system doesn't panic. It adjusts. Gold re-enters this story not because anyone suddenly became nostalgic, but because gold never promised something it couldn't deliver. Gold does not offer yield. It does not offer efficiency. It does not offer growth. What it offers is something much rarer in a politicized system: indifference. Gold does not care who issues sanctions. It does not require a clearing network. It cannot be frozen by pressing a button. It exists where it is stored, or it doesn't. For decades, that feature was considered a flaw. Modern finance preferred abstraction. Paper claims. Layered ownership. Speed. But abstraction only works when trust is stable. When trust erodes, abstraction becomes vulnerability. This is the pivot point where China's behavior stops looking old-fashioned and starts looking coldly rational. China did not attack the dollar, it ignored it. Western commentary often frames China's gold accumulation as hostility, or even retaliation. That framing misunderstands China's posture entirely. China didn't declare war on the dollar. It didn't demand de-dollarization. It didn't ask the world to choose sides. Instead, it did something much quieter. It built an alternative context in which dependence on the dollar was no longer absolute. And the critical move here was not the buying of gold itself, it was what China built around gold. Because markets reveal intent not through rhetoric, but through infrastructure. In the West, gold largely lives on paper. Futures. ETFs. Unallocated accounts. Ownership is mediated. Delivery is rare. Claims stack on top of claims. That works perfectly, until somebody wants physical certainty. China never trusted that model. The Shanghai Gold Exchange was built with physical delivery as the center, not the exception. Gold is treated as a logistical asset, not a speculative one. Bars are identifiable. Custody matters. Settlement means movement. This design choice is not about efficiency. It's about what happens under stress. China was not optimizing for market convenience. It was preparing for scenarios where paper promises may not settle cleanly. Then the system expanded outward. Vaults in Hong Kong. Settlement channels across Asia. Integrations reaching into the Middle East and Africa. This wasn't branding. It was plumbing. No one spends years building physical monetary infrastructure unless they are planning for a future where physical trust matters again. Here is where the conspiracy becomes systemic rather than national. Basel III reclassified gold as a Tier 1 asset. On the surface, this looked like a technical update. In practice, it rehabilitated gold inside the global banking system. For decades, gold had been treated as something banks could hold, but should avoid. It was penalized. Discouraged. Pushed to the margins. Basel III removed that penalty. That single regulatory change did not announce a return to gold, but it reopened the door just enough for states to step through quietly. Because the most powerful changes in finance are not mandates. They are removed constraints. Once gold was no longer treated as inferior collateral, entire categories of behavior became permissible again. And China had already built the infrastructure to take advantage of that shift. This is where the narrative widens, and where most people stop paying attention. For developing countries, dollar dependence is not abstract. It shapes debt, growth, crisis cycles, and political leverage. Historically, development required borrowing in dollars. Borrowing in dollars meant exposure to exchange risk. Exchange risk meant vulnerability. Gold-backed or gold-adjacent financing changes that equation, not dramatically, but incrementally. If gold can be deposited, valued, and used as collateral without passing through US-controlled financial choke points, negotiating power shifts. Not because the system is overthrown, but because alternatives exist. Alternatives soften pressure. That is how power erodes in real life. The US position, dominant, but no longer the only choice. None of this means the dollar is collapsing. That is jumping to a simple conclusion without analyzing the problem. The dollar remains dominant because it still works. US capital markets are still unmatched. Liquidity still flows through treasuries. But dominance is not immortality. The moment a system stops being the only choice, it begins to change character. Gold does not replace the dollar. It reduces dependence on it. And dependence, not preference, is where real power lives. Retail investors obsess over gold's price because that is how they are trained to think. States do not think like that. Gold for a state is not about returns. It is about survivability. Gold can underperform for decades and still be doing its job. The job is not to grow. The job is to be there when rules stop behaving politely. China is not betting on gold going up next year. It is betting on uncertainty lasting longer than narratives. That is not fear. That is acknowledgement. No secret pact was needed. The system aligned itself. The US weaponized financial infrastructure because it was effective. Other countries noticed because they were affected. Gold quietly became relevant again because it was unaffected. Just a gradual realization spreading through institutions that neutrality had regained value. And once neutrality becomes scarce, whoever offers it gains leverage. Why this shift will feel invisible until it isn't. This will not feel like a turning point. There will be no gold standard 2.0. No headline announcing a reset. What will happen instead is something far duller, slightly more trade settled outside dollars, slightly more reserves held elsewhere, slightly more collateral diversity, slightly less faith in single-point systems. When enough slightly accumulate, the world looks back and realizes something changed. And by then, the people who prepared will already be insulated. The uncomfortable ending is that China does not need the dollar to fail. It only needs the dollar to stop being the only choice. Gold is not a weapon. It is a shield. And when states start quietly choosing shields, it is not because war is coming, it is because certainty has left the room. But a system slowly rearranging itself around risk it no longer trusts to stay theoretical. Up to now, it's still possible to tell yourself a comforting story. You can say, okay, countries are hedging. That's normal. Central banks diversify. Gold comes and goes. This doesn't really affect everyday life. That story feels reasonable, and that's why it's dangerous. Because structural shifts don't announce themselves by breaking convenience first. They break assumptions first. And most assumptions don't live in spreadsheets or treaties, they live in expectations, the expectation that money is neutral. The expectation that access will remain open. The expectation that systems will behave tomorrow the way they behaved yesterday. Once those expectations weaken, the system can continue operating, but it stops compounding trust. It starts quietly consuming it. And gold matters precisely at that stage. For most of modern financial history, trust did not need to be priced. You didn't ask whether your reserves might be frozen. You didn't model whether settlement systems could be weaponized. You didn't factor political alignment into collateral planning. Trust was assumed, and assumptions are the cheapest input in any system. What we are watching now is the slow monetization of mistrust. Every workaround built into the system has a cost. Every redundancy reduces efficiency. Every alternative increases friction. Gold is not free. Physical custody is not free. Parallel payment rails are not free. But neither is dependence. And once trust becomes conditional, the cost-benefit analysis changes. Efficiency stops being the sole objective. Resilience enters the equation. That is the point at which states start acting in ways that look irrational to markets, but perfectly rational to long-term planners. People misunderstand this shift is by framing it as competition. Will gold replace the dollar? Will the yuan replace the dollar? Who wins? That framing assumes that power only changes hands through substitution. In reality, subtraction is often enough. The dollar doesn't need to disappear. It only needs to lose its certainty. Gold doesn't need to dominate reserves. It only needs to be relevant again. And relevance changes behavior. If even a small percentage of trade can settle without dollars, negotiating posture shifts. If even a fraction of reserves sit outside dollar control, leverage softens. If even some lending happens via alternative collateral, dependency erodes. None of those require majority share. They require optionality. Once optionality exists, it spreads, quietly. From the outside, it looks like countries are being offered choices. Pick the dollar. Pick gold. Pick the yuan. That's not how it feels inside the system. Inside the system, what changes is what happens when things go wrong. The dollar system works beautifully in normal times. Gold matters when normal times feel less guaranteed. That distinction is essential. China does not need gold for the future it hopes for. It needs gold for futures it can't rule out. And those futures don't need to be catastrophic, only uncomfortable. Sanctions friction. Payment delays. Political conditionality creeping into financial decisions. These are not crisis events. They are irritations. And irritations reshape flows more reliably than shock. Gold didn't suddenly become useful. What changed was who controls trust. In a system where financial infrastructure is treated as neutral commons, abstraction thrives. Paper claims, leverage, speed, all of it works. In a system where infrastructure is openly instrumentalized for policy goals, neutrality becomes scarce. At that point, physicality regains value. It's not nostalgia. It's geometry. Gold exists outside policy control zones by default. That doesn't make it perfect. It makes it predictable. And predictability, not return, is what reserve assets exist to provide. Why institutions move first and people notice last. Most people experience monetary systems passively. You don't choose settlement currencies. You don't decide reserve composition. You don't negotiate payment rails. Institutions do that for you. And institutions move long before narratives catch up. They adjust policies. Rewrite regulations. Test corridors. Build pilot systems. By the time these changes filter down into public discourse, the infrastructure already exists. This is why the China gold story never feels urgent, until it does. There is no single moment where something breaks. There is a long period where something solidifies. And once that solidification finishes, reversing it becomes extremely expensive. Here's a layer that almost never enters the discussion, but should. When trust fragments, the people who suffer first are not the powerful. They are the late entrants. Countries with large historical reserves adapt more easily. Institutions that built parallel systems early enjoy flexibility. Those that arrive late inherit friction. This mirrors what happens in every leveraged system. Early participants profit from stability. Late participants bear adjustment costs. Gold accumulation is, in that sense, a timing strategy. Not to win, but to avoid being last. A lot of people dismiss this analysis as paranoia. Markets adapt. Globalization won't reverse. This is just noise. And they're partially right. Markets do adapt. Globalization doesn't collapse overnight. The dollar isn't disappearing. But dismissing structural hedging as paranoia misunderstands how states behave. States do not plan for what they believe will happen. They plan for what they cannot afford to be wrong about. Gold sits firmly in that category. It's not optimism or pessimism. It's irreversibility management. If this story plays out the way most structural shifts do, there is no explosive finale. No reset button. No gold standard announcement. No televised crisis. What happens instead is subtle: monetary gravity disperses, financial veto power weakens, infrastructure multipolarity becomes normal. Gold doesn't emerge as king. It emerges as a floor. A thing that doesn't grow trust, but absorbs mistrust. And once that function returns, it rarely disappears again. Here's the emotional core people struggle with. This shift doesn't guarantee disaster. It doesn't guarantee peace either. What it guarantees is uncertainty spreads instead of concentrating. Centralized systems excel at efficiency. Decentralized buffers excel at survival. Gold is not a solution. It is a symptom. A symptom of a world where certainty has become political and neutrality has become expensive. There's a comforting belief built into most modern societies, especially ones that have lived under a single dominant system their entire lives. That belief goes something like this. If something gets messy, eventually it gets fixed. Institutions reform. Rules adjust. Trust returns. History does not support that belief. What history shows instead is far more unsettling. Trust does not rebound symmetrically. It doesn't flow back to the center once alternatives exist. It disperses, lingers, and settles into new shapes. And once that happens, power doesn't disappear, it diffuses. This is where gold stops being a tactical hedge and becomes a structural marker. Trust behaves very differently on the way up than it does on the way down. To build trust, you need time, consistency, boring reliability, and the absence of surprises. To lose it, you need exactly one moment that forces people to rerun their assumptions. You don't need collapse. You don't need fraud. You don't even need failure. You just need conditionality. The second an asset stops behaving neutrally, even once, its future role changes permanently. Because now every holder has to ask not, will this work, but, under what circumstances will this stop working? That question is corrosive. And corrosive questions are not solved by reassurance. They are solved by reduction of exposure. Gold thrives in exactly that environment. Not because it is superior, but because it asks fewer questions. There is a myth that once a system proves itself stable again, trust naturally returns. Sometimes that happens locally. Rarely does it happen globally. Once countries build alternatives, they discover something uncomfortable but liberating: they no longer need to believe. Belief is expensive. Belief requires vulnerability. Belief requires the suspension of paranoia. Alternatives remove the need for belief. You don't have to trust when you have redundancy. You don't have to approve when you have optionality. You don't have to align when you have insulation. That psychological shift is irreversible. This is why financial systems that lose exclusivity almost never regain it, even if they remain dominant. They continue operating. They just stop being sacred. And money, once desacralized, becomes negotiable. At this stage, it's important to make something very clear. Gold is not becoming the system. It is becoming the backstop that people stop arguing about. Gold does not need enforcement. It does not rely on political goodwill. It does not require belief in future behavior. That makes it uniquely suited for a world where trust is no longer assumed. When states hold gold, they are not making a statement about returning to the past. They are acknowledging that future rules may not align with present assurances. Gold doesn't care what those rules are. That indifference is its power. Once alternatives exist, state behavior evolves. Not dramatically. Not ideologically. Practically. Countries stop over-concentrating reserves. They spread settlement risk. They restructure contracts. They redesign contingencies. None of this shows up on the nightly news. And that's exactly why it works. The system remains intact on the surface, until suddenly everyone realizes that a single actor can no longer dictate defaults. Gold plays a subtle role here. It does not move markets daily. It does not discipline behavior overtly. It simply removes the fear of exclusion. And fear of exclusion is the ultimate enforcement tool in any dominant system. Dominant systems thrive on centralized dependency. The more everything runs through one channel, the easier it is to regulate, monitor, influence, and control. Redundancy undermines that, slowly. When multiple settlement paths exist, leverage weakens. When collateral sources diversify, coercion costs rise. When exits are credible, threats lose sharpness. This is not about morality. It's about structure. Gold is structurally annoying to control. That's why it keeps reappearing whenever systems overreach. There is a real price to this fragmentation. Gold is inefficient. Parallel systems are slower. Redundant infrastructure wastes resources. In purely economic terms, this is a downgrade. But history shows that efficiency collapses faster than resilience fails. Systems optimize until they snap. Then they regret not having slack. Gold is slack. It's insurance you hope expires unused.